Project has undergone an initial study under the California Environmental Quality Act. A negative declaration was adopted for this specific project. Also, I should point out that no application has been received for what's talked about of the surf supermarket redevelopment. There is no application on file for that. We've heard some testimony today that it may be forthcoming, or it could be 5-10 years, or something longer than that. Also, it probably should be pointed out that if you're going to talk about segmentation, in part it's brought on by dual jurisdiction, of the Coastal Commission as well as the County of Mendocino. The Coastal Commission has jurisdiction where the existing retaining wall has failed on the property immediately to the south under the Bauer ownership. That needs to be corrected. That needs to be fixed. The County of Mendocino has jurisdiction on the property immediately to the north. You can't submit one application to address both of them because one is under the jurisdiction of the Coastal Commission, one's under the jurisdiction of Mendocino County. So in part the segmentation, if there is one, is brought on by dual jurisdiction under the State Coastal Act and under coastal requirements. The project is to address an existing drainage and erosion problem, and at least as it was brought up to me as the coastal permit administrator, it physically ties back into the retaining wall to address the failure of that existing retaining wall. It makes no sense to have retaining walls that are perpendicular, that are at odd angles. It just doesn't work. Lastly, what I would say is that the projects that have been talked about, one was a demolition permit, demolition project that was subject to a permit. The other was this specific project. The other is this potential future project. The action on any one of those is an independent action which does not in any way bind future actions. In other words, I think you can approve one of them, deny the next. It's not a series of dominoes that are set up in front of you that if you knock over that first domino, all of them will fall in order. They are independent actions into themselves. So I did want to briefly address that, at least from my perspective, the piecemealing issue under CEQA.
Does that conclude your
Yes, it does.
Wrap-up remarks?
Yes.
Okay, let's go to the board for comments, questions, concerns to the staff, the applicant, and or the public maybe responding to some of those questions. Supervisor Colfax.
This is an interesting position to be in. We have the GMAC, which I have supported and been supported by for the nearly 10 years I've been on the board, voting 4-2 to approve this project, to reject this appeal. And on the other hand, I have the individual who's been good enough to serve as the 5th District Planning Commissioner, who is leading the effort or being involved in a significant way, I should say, to the challenge to this particular project. So if for me, from a point of view of a supervisor, it's a no-win solution. It's not a win-win situation, but it's certainly a you lose-lose situation where, however I go, I'm going to have people who have invested an awful lot of time in this particular project being unhappy with the person who they've really aided over the years. Having said that, I have a couple of questions that kind of bother me. Mr. Hall, I come back to the standalone question. I've essentially 3 questions. I'll try to be as brief as possible, and then we may want to come back to them. With regard to this being a standalone project, on the one hand, I've gotten letters saying that this is terrific because we'll have this view, we'll have this open space, it'll be good, we'll have more opportunities, but that makes it not a standalone project in the eyes of so many of the people who are advocating for this project, saying this is good for the town of Mendocino. And I have to ask myself, you mean because you're going to improve runoff on the bluff, it's good for the town? I mean, come on, how many places do we have problems like this up and down the coast of Mendocino where we don't go and say it would be really good for that stretch to have a protective wall built of significant proportion. So the standalone part of it bothers me a little bit. On the one hand, it is being supported because it's a standalone project, and it's being opposed because it's a standalone project. What is it, again, in terms of your perception of how you justify this project with regard to the perception, the connection between the additional project 3, 4, 5 years down the road? Is that coloring your thinking? Or not? In other words, why has this not been segmented if it is, in fact, a project that we are considering only this particular project? Why do all these other variables come into play in this discussion coming from the professional staff?
Well, I cannot answer for people that have the public that's commented to
Not
you
the
about
public,
the
I'm talking
about
about
the wonderful thing, the wonderful views that would be opened by the redevelopment of that
Right.
project.
Well,
I can
these
tell you
things
what,
did enter into it.
I can
That's
tell
what
you
I'm
what
saying.
my rationale was when I approved that project, and I've mentioned that in my discussion of piecemealing. This project that's before you today does not open up any views. That may or may not be a future project in terms of the redevelopment of that. So I'm looking, and I think appropriately so, solely at the project that's in front of you today.
Now, the project that's solely in front of us today, then, is because there's a parking lot which is prior development. It's a developed site.
I can go back to photographs from 1987 that show parking on this back area.
And so, on the basis of that, then, this project is permissible precisely because there is development on that site at this time. If this were a newly developed, if there were nothing on that site, and we said, well, we want to build this wall here so I can build my house right up close to the edge,
If this were
this would be rejected out of hand,
If
correct?
this were a vacant lot, I don't believe that they would have the ability under the policies and the coastal plan to construct a retaining wall. But there are existing improvements on the site, including, at least for this individual case, you've got for lack of a better term, the septic tank, as well as the parking area.
And that qualifies it as, so that is what allows this to happen, is what you're saying, in effect.
That allows us to overcome, I believe, that policy that talks about only to protect existing development. The definition of development in the Coastal Act is extremely broad, and clearly the parking area, if one were to go in and put in that parking area today, it would be classified as development. To put in that septic tank would be classified as development. Therefore, I can't choose and pick when I say something is protecting development. That term development is defined in the Coastal Act.
Okay. And the question, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I probably am, my understanding was we are not protecting as a matter of policy, or have not been protecting as a matter of policy, Mendocino County, coastal, we are not taking into account, rather, forget about protecting. We are not taking into account when we approve or disapprove a coastal site for construction, 75-year, 100 years setback. This is not a consideration more generally. In other words, we would not be putting up these walls up and down the coast every place we have a developed site that needs to be protected. Is that right?
I'm not sure I'm following the question.
Let's say I'm building, I look at some of these buildings here a little bit to the north on this site. They look pretty damn close to the edge to me. And I just hope the engineering is good enough that they're not going to fall over the edge here in 20 years and we'd be asked to come in and approve a wall to protect them from further collapsing. But we have no policy with